Hello and welcome to the Gothic Color channel. This video is to introduce my Into the Sunset design with information on how you can use it to make a gathered summer skirt using 1 meter of printed fabric and an extra meter of plain fabric. You can also make a simpler version using only the 1 meter of printed fabric to make a shorter skirt. I will be explaining how you can do this during this video. As usual, I am going to start by talking about my design and then move on to the sewing. In the description box below, I have links to the different sections of the video, so you can easily skip ahead to the section you are most interested in. So if you are only interested in the construction of the skirt, then you can go ahead and skip to that part. The Into the Sunset design that is used in this video is one of 3 color variations inspired by the jewel tones you can get in nature as sunbeams go through different materials. The other 2 variations are called Into the Forest and Into the Ocean, and the design is an abstract textural gradient that forms subtle vertical stripes. Links to all 3 color variations can be found in the description box of this video. So let me start by showing you the printouts that I received from my 2 shops. On the top are those from spoonflower.com and on the bottom are those from fashionformula.com. Starting with the Into the Forest gradient, we have a bright green gradient that starts from near black, working through emerald green, bright leaf green, finishing in a lighter chartreuse at 50 centimeters, before working back the same colors all the way to near black to complete the whole meter of fabric. On these printouts I am showing, however, you can see half the gradient, since the gradient then mirrors itself. As you can see on the printout from Fashion Formula, the colors are a bit warmer and have a bit of an olive green hue. The printout from Spoonflower is more neutral and brighter in color. Next we have the Into the Ocean gradient, which, as you can guess, goes through blue hues, starting again from near black, going through indigo, a mid blue and finishing with a pastel aqua, before again going through the darker colors. The main difference between the printouts here is in the darker colors, where the indigo on the Spoonflower version is closer to a purple than it is on the Fashion Formula one. Finally, we have the Into the Sunset gradient, where we have a bright, colourful gradient starting from near black, going through purple, red, orange and finishing with yellow at 50 centimeters of fabric, and then, as with the others, going back through the same colours. As you can see, there are very minor variations in the colours between Fashion Formula and the Spoonflower printouts, but such little differences can also be seen over printing different materials as well. So let me show you, for example, the actual 1 meter fabric that I got for making the skirt on this video. This fabric is from Fashion Formula and it is their 100% bamboo fabric, and you may be able to see how much darker the orange color of the gradient appears on this fabric in comparison to both the Spoonflower and the Fashion Formula printouts, which are both printed, if I remember correctly, on different types of polycotton. The reason I am pointing this out is just to give an example as to why it can be important to get a sampler on the actual fabric you're planning to use for your projects, as different colors may come out somewhat differently depending on the material they're printed on. One last thing about samplers, the printouts I have shown you so far are ones I ordered so I could check the full gradient to make sure that all the colors look alright. If you order a standard sampler, what you will get is this, a roughly 20 centimeters, 8 inches square, so you will not be able to check the full gradient. So, in case someone wanted to do so, I have also uploaded onto my shops this type of gradient tester that you can see here, which you can order as a quarter fabric and where you can check all 3 color variants on one printout. Anyway, let's move on to materials and measurements for the gathered skirt. You will need threads to match your fabric. I am showing here black and pale yellow, though I did use some orange and red thread too. The needles I used on my sewing machine were size 75, using stretch needles on my elastic and sharps on my fabric. You will need elastic for your waist. I used 1 meter, about 39¼ inches of a 15 centimeters or 6 inches wide black elastic. This makes for quite a wide waistband. You can of course choose to go for something narrower if you want to. For the version of the skirt I made, I also used some black cotton fabric that was about 155 centimeters wide and 50 centimeters long. That is roughly 61 inches wide and 19½ inches long. And finally, the 100% bamboo printed fabric, which was 140 centimeters wide and 1 meter long. That's roughly 55 inches wide and about 39¼ inch long. These were for the skirt to fit on measurements of 82 centimeters or about 32 inches waist and 104 centimeters or about 41 inches hips. Of course, depending on your measurements, you will need to make sure that you have enough elastic and that the width of the fabric attached to it fits over your hips. So, moving on to the construction of the skirt. Firstly, I washed and pressed the fabrics, and I cut the printed one in half along the center of the gradient. The plan here is to join the two sections into a wide tube that will be gathered to form the lower part of the skirt. Then I put those aside and worked on the elastic. Firstly, I checked to see how much stretch the elastic has and decided that for this elastic and the fit that I wanted for the waist, I could cut the elastic at exactly my measurements, planning for 1 centimeter, that's 3/8 inch seam allowances. Since the elastic I used was very wide, it worked as a yoke and I cut it that way. I decided on this yoke to start about 4 centimeters, about 1.5 inches over my natural waist, and end at about 11 centimeters or 4¼ inch below it, so at around the upper hip area. The easiest way of finding the right shape for your yoke is to take your measurements in halves. I wore a close-fitting top with side seams that covered this area and measured from seam to seam the front and back separately at the top where I wanted the yoke to start, the natural waist, and the upper hip area where I wanted the yoke to end. I then cut the elastic in two, making sure that I could definitely fit the widest measurements on the two pieces. Then, taking each piece separately and folding it in half, I marked the 4 centimeters point from the top to find the waist position, and then marked from the folded end half of each measurement. So, to explain, starting with the front piece, I measured at the top half of my top front measurement from the folded end, and then 4 centimeters down half of my front natural waist measurement, and then at the end half of my upper hip measurement. So when I cut along my markings and unfolded the elastic, I could have the full measurements for the front of my yoke. I did the same thing with the back measurements on the second piece of elastic. Next, I matched the edges of the front and back pieces. Depending on your shape, you may need to convince the elastic to match well because it needs to go into a 3-dimensional shape when it doesn't necessarily want to. In order to be able to sew exactly my shape, I first pinned the edges together and then basted them firmly together to avoid any shifting while feeding them through the sewing machine. Here you can see the seam finished. You can flatten the seam allowances on the inside, or you can do as I did, which was to fold both seam allowances towards the back of the yoke and top stitch them into place in order to make the side seams extra secure. When top stitching, you will need to follow the curvature of the yoke in order to preserve it, as you can see here. Then I moved on to dealing with the black fabric. If you are more interested in the shorter version of this skirt that doesn't use extra fabric, you can skip this bit, though bear in mind that you will need to use pretty much the same method to attach the fabric to the elastic as I do with this black fabric. So firstly, I sewed it close to form a tube. I finished the top of the tube with a simple zigzag stitch to avoid any fraying and did a small hem at the other end. Then I pinned the fabric to the elastic. Having the elastic yoke the right way out, I put it into the fabric tube that was turned inside out. This way I had right sides together. I then started matching the top of the fabric tube to the bottom of the elastic yoke. I put the seam of the fabric at the back and matched it to the middle point of the back of the yoke. Then, folding across that point, I found the middle point of the front of the yoke and that of the fabric tube and matched those together. I continued folding and matching each section until I felt I had enough pins to help me feed the stretched elastic with the correct section of the fabric through the sewing machine. If the fabric you are using is much wider than the elastic when stretched, this will most likely be the case if you make the skirt using only the printed fabric, you may find it easier if you partly gather the fabric first. More on this shortly. I used a wide zigzag stitch to attach the fabric to the elastic. And here you can see what it looks like when finished. Next, I moved back to the printed fabric and sewed up the edges, matching up the gradient. I then finished the seams with a zigzag stitch to stop any fraying and cut off any excess fabric from the seam allowances. I also hemmed the end since I wanted the hem to follow along the gradient. This meant that the exact length of the skirt had to depend on where the fabric was attached at the top rather than depend on the hem. Next, I sewed 2 basting stitches along the top of the fabric at a low tension so I could gather it. I knotted the ends of the stitches on both sides and started gathering using the bobbin threads, as you can see here. I gathered this to the circumference of the black fabric that forms the top part of the skirt, which worked to about 153 centimeters. If you are to make the skirt without the extra fabric, you will need to find out how much the circumference of the lower part of the elastic is after stretching. If you did the stretch test I did at the beginning of the construction of the skirt, this should be easy to calculate. So, for example, if 20 centimeters of the elastic used stretches roughly to 30 centimeters, then it stretches by 50%. If the circumference of the elastic yoke at the high hip area is, say, 100 centimeters, then it can stretch to 150 centimeters. So, you will need to gather the fabric to that before attaching it to the elastic the way I attached the black fabric earlier. By the way, if any of this is confusing, do let me know in the comment section below and I will try to clarify. Going back to this version of the skirt, I did a fitting of the top part of the skirt and marked the line I wanted to join the black and printed fabrics together, making sure this line was parallel to the floor. I used a running thread through this line to make it easier for me to see where I needed to join the fabrics. Having the black fabric and elastic the right way out and the printed fabric the wrong way out, I put the black fabric into the printed fabric tube up to the line I marked during the fitting and started pinning them together, making sure that the side seams were at about the same point as the side seams of the elastic in order to make things neat. I then used a zigzag stitch to join the fabrics together. The zigzag stitch is not strictly speaking needed here. It was needed on the elastic in order to allow it to stretch, but I used the same stitch to create a similar effect on the seam between the two fabrics, as you can see here. Next, I removed my basting and cut off the excess fabric from the seam allowance, and then I used the lower part of the black fabric to finish and strengthen the seam. I folded the black fabric over the seam allowance of the printed fabric to cover it and then sewed it up. The rest of the black fabric sits under the printed fabric and works as a lining, as you can see here. So finally, after washing and drying, here is the completed skirt. I wanted this skirt to finish below the knee, but hopefully you can see how it could also work as a shorter skirt without the black section. Also, you could make the skirt so it starts with the lighter part of the gradient at the top and ends with the darker part at the bottom. For my next video, I am making something that will be separate from my 1 meter fabric videos. It is a 50s style shirt using one of my animal head prints, and it requires much more fabric than what I have used in my recent videos. It will hopefully be interesting as a project. I have to say it has definitely been a learning curve for me so far, and I have only just started working on it. In the meantime, do subscribe and click on notifications so you get notified of my next upload. Goodbye!